Yes.
Good. So we know that even the organization of the brain, the way the brain functions, has to do with what's coming in through the senses. If you deprive a newborn of anything to see, it doesn't take long before it can't see anything. That's why we have these little mobiles and lots of stimulation, because that actually makes their brain develop. But whatever a nervous system does perceive is contained within itself, and we call that property subjective. Now it just so happens, it's a contingent fact, is the way the philosophers say it, that some of our perceptions are intersubjective. I see it, you see it, they see it, somebody from a block away comes and sees it. Some of what we perceive doesn't depend on who's doing the perceiving, and some of what we perceive is done for us by machines. None of us can see in the x-ray. This is a little thing sometimes that theists pull up. Well, you can't see x-rays, but you believe in them, don't you? Yes, but we have machines that can measure the x-rays, even though we can't see in that part of the electromagnetic spectrum. From the fact that there are these kinds of perceptions, we call them objective perceptions, but what we really mean is intersubjective perceptions. From that, we infer the existence of something that exists no matter whether anybody's looking at it or not. It's a very good inference we call objective reality. What is that? An inference. And the body of facts and understanding, the way that we fit such facts together about this objective reality, and the methods that we use to do it, and the things that we are able to do with it, we call science. Now, there remains a very important part of our experience, though, that resists incorporation into science, and these are the perceptions that are not intersubjective, the things that remain subjective. Now, you may tell me that you have a toothache, for example, or that you're in communication with another being, another mind that has no body and is undetectable by any objective means. It's, Mr. Nobody who lives in your closet or whatever. And there may be some specific neural activity in your brain that I could measure that is associated with your telling me such things. But the specific subjective experience of having a toothache or talking to God, whatever that may be, is inaccessible to everyone but the person having it. In the past, people got into the habit, just a habit of projecting such experiences outside of themselves. They theorized that God sent the toothache, or that there was an actual dream time or dreamscape outside of themselves, someplace you go when you're asleep. We remember it. We were there. I saw you. It was an intelligible and understandable inference for our distant ancestors to make. And after all of our perceptions seem like they're out there. Certainly when a dream, it's just like being waking reality, but it's a different world. But this way of looking at things led to such things as punishing people for doing things to other people in their dreams. They actually did this in these primitive cultures. I wake up, oh, kid, you punched me in my dream. You're going to have to pay for that. You're like, what? They did that. And of course, killing people, we know about this. Killing people whom others say they saw them consorting with the devil. Even worse, this idea of supernaturalism never panned out. Not only did it result in those bad things, it just didn't work. Diseases were shown to be caused by microorganisms and other objectively demonstrable causes. When they got to the top of Mount Olympus, there were no enclaves of deities up there. There were none under the sea. There were none in volcanoes, or even in what turned out to be an unimaginably vast universe, once simply referred to as the skies. The firmament did not turn out to be a crystal sphere around the earth. So supernaturalism turned out to be claims about the world beyond our subjective experience, the world out there that had no support beyond subjective perceptions, like this kitty cat looking in the mirror and seeing a lion looking back. Supernaturalism is simply a category mistake. Here's a category mistake. What time does the game start? 2 p.m. Dang, and all I brought was an AM radio. In the 21st century, for some time before, what we mean when we say that we have some knowledge of the world outside of our subjective perceptions is the sort of knowledge that science, and only science, can and does give us. Now, we know that science doesn't tell us everything, but that has nothing to do with the fact that it is the only way that we can figure out things about objective reality. Nor does either of these things mean that our subjective experience and things that we imagine don't exist. They do exist in our subjective experience. So we must not think of them in the same way as we think about the world of experience that is not observer dependent. It's not that science cannot disprove God. That's not really the whole truth. We hear that all the time. It's not that science can't disprove it, it's that science cannot even disprove what you're feeling when you have a toothache. But at least it's now generally recognized that your toothache is something in your own head. Sensible people do not cite their toothache as proof of something out in the objective world that we all inhabit, perceive, and try to make sense of together. And for this reason, it is absurd, it is wrong and immoral for anyone to say that other people are going to hell or are doing things that God opposes based on their own subjective sense of what a holy book says or what some priests or imams told them. And that's our moment of philosophy of science. This next block of material was prepared by Kit Robertson, yay, who I invited to present. She said, hell no, she doesn't like to do that, but she might change her mind sometime. So, at any rate, this is about religious activism on the Texas State Board of Education. An education subject generally just so huge. We had lots of things to choose from, and this is going to turn out to be an endless well, like so many other things we can come back to. In Texas, the State Board of Education consists of 15 uncompensated, they're not paid, but they're elected members of public office who serve 4-year terms. Currently on the board, there are 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats, and they each represent there's a geographical district, so they're elected from districts. Now, what the board does is it sets policies and academic standards and oversees the state's permanent school fund. They also approve textbooks and select curricula for public and charter schools. I inserted this one, Kit, because it just fits so well with the, you read from there? The Texas State Board of Education is well known for its conservative Christian bias because Texas is such a large market for textbooks that they influence the content of textbooks nationwide. Once companies come up with textbooks, they just start selling them to the other states too. Now, how did these religious extremists take over the Texas school board? Can you all read that, by the way?
Yeah.
Best, it's not seek to delude our godless youth that the world be around. Man, I hate selling new textbooks in Texas. Well, after Christian televangelist Pat Robertson lost the Republican primary for U.S. President to George Bush back in, was it 88? He used his remaining campaign funds, quite a bit I guess, to form the Christian Coalition. That's a national nonprofit organization focused on mobilizing Christian voters and campaigning for socially conservative values. Soon afterwards, 49 state chapters were created as independent corporations within their states, including the Christian Coalition of Texas. Initially, the Christian Coalition was just nonprofit, but it applied for permanent tax-exempt status and operated under a provisional tax-exempt status. Note that the term nonprofit is different. It refers to the organization corporation status, that there are no shareholders, whereas a nonprofit is not automatically tax-exempt at either state or federal level. Churches, including the North Texas Church of Freethought, pursue tax-exempt status, and we have tax-exempt status, in fact, because it allows them to avoid paying corporate income tax and provides donors with a tax deduction. Tax-exempt organizations like the NTCOF and other churches are prohibited from campaigning for candidates for public office, but they may advocate for political issues, so we can certainly stand up and say, hey, we want our religious beliefs respected, we like state-church separation. Is she absolutely unhappy?
She just wants to be rocked.
Oh,
Like, so I'm just gonna exit if she starts screaming.
that's good. What did Donald Trump say? Oh, I love babies, let them scream. Yeah. The next generation and all that. So the Christian Coalition began producing these voter guides and distributing them to churches and conservative groups to advise the voters of candidates' views relating to their extremist special interests. The organization also encouraged members to run for state and local offices without revealing their agenda, their affiliation. Voter guides were officially nonpartisan, however, they really did appear to strongly endorse candidates who opposed state-church separation, abortion rights, and so on. In the late 1980s through the mid-1990s, the organization targeted state and local school board races, and it was highly successful in many areas, especially Texas. And some of you may remember, if you lived through those years, Ralph Reed, the Christian Coalition's president at the time, bragging about his guerrilla politics. He said, I travel by night and you don't know what's happening until you open up the body bag and so forth, because they keep the candidates' views concealed until they actually won office. In 1997, Fortune magazine rated CCA Coalition, the Christian Coalition of America, as the 7th most powerful political organization in America.
Is he nuts?
Huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
In the late 1990s, the National Christian Coalition failed to acquire tax-exempt status because of concerns about its political nature. However, by then, some state chapters, including Texas, had been granted this status. Tax-exempt status was important to the Christian Coalition, not just because it encouraged donors, but it would encourage churches to work with the Christian Coalition as a distribution network for their voter guides, without the individual churches fearing their own tax-exempt status being revoked. So what happened is the Texas chapter was renamed Christian Coalition of America and expanded its activities nationwide. This move allowed them to use the state chapter's charitable tax-exempt status in national efforts, where they continued the same political activities. In 1999, a couple of years later, Barry Lynn, Executive Director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. How many have heard of that group? It's a good group. They helped us get our tax exemption. He wrote to the IRS saying, quote, "This is an audacious and outrageous move by Mr. Robertson. If the coalition is continuing the very same partisan political operation that led the IRS to deny it tax exemption, the group should not be able to obtain such an exemption by organizational sleight of hand." And the coalition's brazen attempt to remain tax exempt while devoting the bulk of its activities to partisan politics is simply unacceptable. Well, it took a few years, but finally in 2005, the coalition reached a settlement with the IRS where they were allowed to keep a tax-exempt status, which permitted them to avoid paying corporate income tax, but denied their members the ability to deduct their donations on their personal taxes. Well, throughout the 2000s, the CCA declined in influence after internal dissension among high-ranking members and lawsuits against the organization for failures to pay debts and racial discrimination against employees. Many state chapters severed from the national group and continue to support school board candidates who believe that God needs to be put back in America's schools. From 1994 through 2010, but most especially from 2006 to 2010, the Christian Coalition's candidates for the Texas State Board of Education exerted a strong influence on the board's activities by voting as a bloc and attempting to revise every possible history, science, and sex education curriculum guideline that didn't favor their religious views. This group included 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat who often voted with them. The board pushed abstinence-only sex education. Texas has among the highest rates of teen pregnancy in the country, and rates of teen pregnancy have been shown to be worse under abstinence-only curriculums. They made changes to textbooks to support their Christian family value viewpoints, such as by removing a picture of a woman holding a briefcase. Can't have that. Removing drawings illustrating self-exams for testicular cancer and breast cancer. Oh my gosh, you're touching yourself. And defining marriage as an institution between one man and one woman. The board revised language arts reading lists to remove selections containing the viewpoints of minority authors. The reason this is a picture of it, you probably can't read it, but here's a book about Marxism, and the author is, my laser not, the author you see is Bill Martin. And then, brown bear, what do you see? Bill Martin Jr. We can't let that children's book written by a Marxist in there, except it turns out the 2 Bill Martins are not the same person. 2 different Bill Martins. Idiotic. All right, we have a little clip here. The board banned an environmental science book due to climate change content. And over the last 35 years, federal case law has supported the teaching of evolution, of course, and rejected creation science. But that did not prevent the board from trying to replace the teaching of evolution with creationism. But they did openly seek to undermine evolution by including information that they saw as weaknesses in the theory of evolution and encouraging students to evaluate scientific evidence for and against evolution. By including debate on evolution, they expected teachers who support creationism would use these discussions to advocate for creationism. Additionally, requiring students to evaluate evidence for and against evolution allowed the board to reject textbooks that failed to include the information that was critical of evolution. It's a long clip, so we're going to stop at a certain point and pick up. Testimony before the Texas State Board, and this is this dentist who's on the board.
Thank you. Even though these biology books are full of unsubstantiated dogmatic statements supporting evolution, there are still 2 major reasons why you should adopt these books. First, by so doing, you will strike the final blow to the teaching of evolution. There are some hidden jewels in these texts just waiting to be mined by inquisitive students that can destroy evolution. In 2009, when the board adopted these new science standards, the evolutionists were painted into a corner. The authors were required to provide scientific evidence for explanations of the sudden appearance of stasis of roots in the fossil record and the complexity of the cell. And most importantly, to identify the specific pages where they were to do so. These sections are the hidden jewels. In the following week, the American Association for the Advancement of Science reported a new science standard for Texas schools, strike a major blow to the teaching of evolution. The adoption of these books represents the final blow, because despite their boastful assertions of robust evidence for evolution, when you actually read those identified sections, the hidden jewels, you will find the evidence incredibly weak to non-existent. And if there's no evidence, there's no evolution. Science, test explanations, classically with controlled experiments, and historically by collecting evidence. Genetics is an excellent example of classical testability. Mendel, in 1865, after growing 29,000 pea plants, empirically reduced the loss of inheritance. Continental drift is an excellent example of historical testability. The obvious bit of the coastlines of Africa and South America, similar geological formations, discovery of the mid-Atlantic ridge and seaboard spreading make a convincing argument. Likewise, evolution is tested historically. Evolutionists need a lot of evidence. How much? Simply must provide enough to explain the origin of everything else in the book. Here's one book's index. 4,000 items. Here is one item, biochemical complexity. How much evidence do the authors provide? They explain the magic wand of words and come up with some simple explanations. Just those stories. The second reason I ask you to adopt these books is because they happen consistently, coincidentally, to support what the Bible says. The Bible says God created all life after their kind. What we see in the world around us supports what the Bible says. We see a myriad of things that replicate themselves and can be organized into distinct classifications.
Dr. McCoy, go ahead and finish since you were a former board member.
Well, I only got about 20 seconds. Not only does, what we see in the world around us supports what the Bible says. But what we see in these books supports what the Bible says. Test it for yourself. Open it, random, any page, and ask yourself if the description and illustration you find supports the claims of the Bible or of evolution. Even the units on evolution support what the Bible says. Because, as demonstrated, they don't even support evolution. Ironically, evolutionists argue that creationists want to force their religious views in the text, but just the teaching of biology does that, and teaching evolution demonstrates that's not how God did it. Since true testable science trumps dogmatism, strike the final blow to the teaching of evolution, support the Bible, and adopt these books.
Questions for it? Mrs. Knight.
Can you clarify for me, Dr. McCoy, when you say adopt these books, which books are you talking about?
All of them. If you look on the reverse side of the page, that first page I gave you, those are the areas of the main publishers, areas that have to deal with sudden appearance of stasis and the complexity of the cell. I want you to adopt these books because if you read those sections, those pages, they have to at least get a hint to the origin of everything else in the biology book. And they're weak. You test things in science. We had a definition of science that was also included in our new standards. It said science is the use of evidence to make testable explanations. You test it in two ways in science. Historically, it's the way you have to test evolution. You cannot evolve something in a lab. I mean, you can claim some stuff, but you don't evolve a new cat or something like that in the lab. You're going to have to look at historical evidence.
This is what your tax dollars are being spent on, folks. Jump ahead
The guy's a
to,
blatant liar. They have seen evolution in a lab.
yeah.
I
So-
have now, but maybe at that moment. it
Yeah,
happened.
I'm pretty sure that they had seen it.
All the standard creationist stuff.
This was 2013.
I believe so, yes.
And well, in that case, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Yes, Mr. Rapp.
Always nice. Okay, I want to make sure I understand your process isn't a long question. You want us to adopt the books because you believe that the books lack evidence, therefore the books prove that evolution doesn't exist?
I think what we want to do is have our students, using science, they go to the part of they understand the definition of science, which is in all our new high school science books, use of evidence to make testable explanations. Once they understand what historical science is, like they do show continental drift, one simple separation of 4 facts. Well, how many facts do you need to show evolution? It's in the billions and trillions and trillions. Well, there should be, at least in those sections, to explain it. It should be there. They're not there. And so I'm just hoping a young creationist, young Thomas Ratliff, as a creationist, will sit there and say, look, is this all the evidence they have? Well, maybe God didn't use evolution to do it.
Okay, let me ask you another question. In the AAAS science journal that you mentioned, the new science standards for Texas schools strike a major blow to the teaching of evolution. Isn't that a different statement than strikes a major blow to evolution?
Of course.
So the standards striking a blow as to how it is taught is different than the scientific journal saying that evolution has had a major blow to it.
Well, yeah, but I'll take either one, whatever words they got.
Okay, because it seemed as though you were implying that the Journal of Science was saying.
Well, I think we can.
Okay, let's stick to the books.
Yeah,
We're going to
that's
talk
fine.
about the textbooks instead of a journal.
So your position is that these books prove that evolution doesn't happen and you want us to adopt them?
No. I did not say prove. I just say the evidence is proof.
Thank you.
I don't prove anything. I may be wrong.
You are.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Dr. McElroy.
You'd never know this was going on, you know, but amazing the things that go on in Texas. The board's changes to social studies and history curriculum were the most comprehensive. They passed curriculum standards to outside ultra-conservative groups for review and suggested modification, and then appointed unqualified subject matter experts to the team that was rewriting the standards. One so-called subject matter expert had no formal historical qualification and believed that Hurricane Katrina was a punishment from God for tolerating gays. The board attempted to remove references to historical events predating their biblical determination of the age of the earth, or referred to these events using vague and ambiguous time organizations. They reduced credits to civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King. They removed positive references to Islam and added material praising contributions of conservative leaders, and referred to slaves in the Civil War era as workers. They sought to reshape the very history of America into a Christian nation founded on Christian principles and shaped throughout history by divine influence in such a way that supported their continued attempts to exercise Christian moral authority over social issues. It's time for the next clip here. I hope I'm not talking as fast as that Dennis guy.
The social studies curriculum adoption was even more political, if that's possible, than the science adoption. And the separation of church and state is the crux of the battle. And when Mavis Knight introduced her amendment, she didn't even use the word separation of church and state. She used the words that government can't promote or denigrate any faith. And Cynthia Dunbar passionately argued against this.
Examine the reasons the founding fathers protected religious freedom in America by barring government from promoting or disfavoring any particular religion over all others.
Mavis Knight's amendment was too broad and too amorphous. And talking about barring, which speaks of it in a negative light, when how the founding fathers viewed it was in terms of jurisdiction, that the civil government did not have the jurisdiction to impede upon the ability of religious exercise. free exercise came from a sermon by William Cooper, where he specifically coined the phrase as to the free exercise of his holy religion. This debate is too broad, and one of the things that we keep being hounded by the other side is that the conservatives are trying to inject religion into the text. No, we're not. But nor do we want our religious history to be tainted and drawn from a viewpoint that is not historically accurate. So I cannot support this motion.
This will be a recorded vote. All those in favor of the amendment of a new 1C as proposed by Member Knight, should vote yes. Opposed, the amendment should vote no.
I am stunned that this board rejected teaching students about the First Amendment to the Constitution's protections for religious freedom in this country, and that the government is barred from promoting or disfavoring any religious perspective over all others. That's just shocking, particularly since they've been proclaiming American exceptionalism, and this is one of our nation's founding principles that sets us apart.
Father, I ask that you would forgive us for taking prayer out of the schools. Father, when that happened, secular humanism flooded in. Father, it began to penetrate every part of the curriculum. But today, Lord, we reach up into heaven and we say, on this day, your kingdom come, your will be done in public education once again. We draw the line in the sand today, and we say no more. Lord, I ask that you would invade our schools, invade our country, invade our homes, invade our churches with your presence, that we would truly be hunger for righteousness and for truth, because truth is not a thing. It is a person, and it is the person of Jesus Christ. And your word tells us that if you be lifted up, you will draw all men unto you. And so, God, that's what we do right now. We repent on behalf of our nation. We repent on behalf of ourselves and our families, God, and we lift you up, and we want to see you exalted, God. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I like how they have the barricades to keep the crowd of people from rushing up to the podium.
Yes, isn't that something?
You know, that crowd control thing.
What amazes me is the people who defend religious freedom is the very people who want Christianity and religion in everywhere.
Right, but they want the religious freedom to exclude gays from the economy.
They want religious freedom of
For them.
Christians to rule the world.
For
That's the freedom they
Not
want.
for you. Well, the coalition members clashed with other state officials, especially with the less religious conservatives. I mean, there's lots of people in Texas who are religious, but not of those beliefs. But they were pretty successful at attacking their opponents' characters and painting them as anti-family extremists. At times, the Texas legislature sought to limit the Christian Coalition's board activities. In 2009, the state Senate demoted board member Don McElroy, the guy we saw talking earlier. I'm not talking as fast as he did, right? Might go to a dentist who talks to you like that. Oh. Texas schools were previously required to use textbooks approved by the board, but in 2011, the legislature voted to allow schools to use non-board approved textbooks. Most school districts have continued to use the state-approved textbooks, although this may change as textbooks become obsolete and districts become more aware of available options. So today, the board is less controlled by these ultra-conservative religious board members than it was in 2010, but their influence is going to be felt for a long time. The board revises curriculum standards for each subject every 10 years. It takes a few years afterwards for textbooks to pick up the changes and go through the approval process, and then schools purchase and continue to use the textbooks for a decade or more. Of the three districts which cover Parker, Tarrant, Dallas, and Collin counties, I don't know if you can see from there, those are the districts, and of course they're pretty small up around the high population density in North Texas there. The The November 2016 general elections are going to fill 8 of the other seats. If you live in one of the surrounding counties, then your district is up for election in 2016. Primaries have already selected candidates for these November seats. In the recent East Texas Republican primary, Board of Education candidate Mary Lou Brunner gained nationwide notoriety for her platform centered on representing herself as the true Christian conservative who would put God back into the schools and making numerous extreme and controversial public statements. So, for example, Brunner denies climate change, calling it a ridiculous hoax that, quote, has nothing to do with weather or climate, but is a plot to bring about system change from capitalism to socialism and communism. She claims school shootings occur because students are being taught evolution, claiming evolution is a religious philosophy with propaganda supporting the religion of atheism. She opposes federally funded pre-kindergarten because she believes it opposes Christian values by teaching children to accept Islam and gay marriage. And departing board member Thomas Ratliff, whose seat Brunner was running for, told the Dallas Morning News that she would be a human rain delay. So here's a little more on Brunner. I think this is the last video. Yeah.
Mary Lou Brunner is the likely frontrunner for a seat on the Texas State Board of Education.
I'm biased in favor of Christianity. I'm biased in favor of America.
She's pretty outspoken.
In Texas, we believe that a family has a father and a mother, not two mommies or two daddies.
She thinks President Barack Obama was a gay prostitute who sold his body for drugs. And that public pre-K education is a liberal conspiracy to make toddlers gay. And she wants to decide what goes in children's textbooks. The Texas State Board of Education has 15 members, and they decide what goes into the state's textbooks. Past board members have a reputation for being opinionated.
How do you believe the world began? How long has it been here? And did we share the planet with dinosaurs?
Yes, that's why Texas textbooks have a history of making headlines.
The curriculum doesn't require teaching the Jim Crow laws. Some of the books also limit how much of the curriculum on evolution can be taught.
Some textbooks suggest that Moses was essentially a founding father.
Mary Lou Brunner agrees the textbooks are bad, and she has an explanation for why.
I think the revolutionaries are buying the textbooks. They bought everything else here. I think they're using their influence to get what they want in the textbook.
That's right. It's the Middle East's fault. So she's on a quest to fix the textbooks, and she's bringing some of her other theories with her. Baby dinosaurs were on Noah's Ark, but died because there wasn't enough vegetation. Climate change is a hoax invented by Karl Marx. The Democrats killed JFK. And Islam isn't a religion, and Paul Ryan's beard makes him look like a terrorist. If you want to spread the word about Mary Lou, she's uploaded flyers to her website. And before you ask, yes, they include a quote from Joseph Stalin. Oh, and by the way, that's not even a real Stalin quote. Don't worry, I'm sure all the quotes in the textbooks will be correct.
Texas purchases the second largest number of textbooks in the country, so a lot of the versions that are approved here trickle down into classrooms in other states.
Well, sort of. While the board used to hold considerable sway over national standards, people are starting to realize that public education should be neither religious nor partisan. In 2011, Texas lawmakers even passed a law allowing public schools to use textbooks not approved by the board. So some kids in Texas might learn about Obama's gay prostitute past, but most kids won't be so lucky. This is your mic check.
Who produced that?
Huh?
Who produced that?
Something Mike.
Mic check, Emma?
Yeah, that might.
Well, in March of this year, Brunner won 48% of the primary vote in her district. Since she fell short of the 50%, she advanced to a runoff primary election with her closest challenger, Kevin Ellis. Had she won this runoff election, she would have likely won a seat on the board in the general election due to the large majority of her political party. Proponents of church-state separation can heave a sigh of relief that Ellis defeated her in the runoff, but it is disturbing to see an extreme opponent of church-state separation come so close to office. And remember we started out with the books on the left, now they're on the right, so that's the beginning and the end. insert this one in here too. Here's this little boy saying, "And Moses put the Ten Commandments in the Constitution to keep the Muslim socialists from undermining free enterprise with evolution and climate change. Oh, and slavery was fun." The father says, "Boy's gone on saving flow," and she says, "No, just studying his new textbooks." Well, there are a few other problems in education. As I started out saying, it's a huge, huge subject. And the bulletin has a little bit about very generic food for thought, really maybe more an appetizer, but here's one that stuck with me because of personal experience. Get to that in a second. When I started first grade, I was 5 years old then. I remember to this day the desk I sat in, it was next to the window. The door was over here, the nun sat up front. I was facing east. And I remember when I started that grade that I often filled out little pages of math problems that the nuns handed out. And when I got mine back, it had stars on them. And I remember the other kids being very unhappy about that. So I made sure after a time or two that I always left a few of the little problems blank, and then the stars wouldn't be there. So I would not get them back with the stars, and the other kids wouldn't hate me and punch me. Getting those stars, I learned, made me an object of hatred. So this old memory, which I hadn't thought about in years and years, blazed back into life when I happened to come across this quote by Barack Obama from the 2004 Democratic National Convention address. He said, "Children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a black youth with a book is acting white." I'd heard of this thing, acting white, before, but I'd never given it much thought. After all, I'm white, so I should act white, right? But here I realized that youngsters with more melanin in their skin had a word for doing what I did that was drawing the ire of these other kids when I was in first grade, acting white. It seems to me that this term and what it means is as hateful as the N-word, even though it is applied by blacks. None of them are black, they're just brown, more brown than, we're not white either, we're beige or something. So it seems to me that this term just is ridiculous, it's absurd, and it's a destructive piece of America's color-coded society that we still are burdened with, of our color-coded culture that has its roots in the color-coded system of slavery in America that it took a destructive war that almost broke our nation to finally get rid of. This business of acting white as an obstacle to achievement is real. It's been studied by the sociologists, and I'm not convinced that they've gotten it all figured out, but it is clearly deep-rooted. It has to do with group identity, and especially if the most superior people of the group are threatening to leave, they're kind of shamed into sticking it out. It is the slander, though, that's not so easily eradicated as President Obama has found. And consider this. You see that graph? It shows that grade point average, as grade point average increases, here's the popularity index. They did this from questionnaires that they had where they had these like multi-page questionnaires that they drew on. Apparently the sociologists figured out ways to create data. And they looked up, because the questionnaires had, who are your friends? And they were actually able to identify and figure out, and they developed an algorithm for figuring out how popular you were based on the number of friends and whether you had among your friends the most popular other kids in school. But look at it, as your grade point goes up, the popularity goes down. This is the black popularity. Here's the white popularity. And the Hispanics are even worse than the black kids. Popularity going down as their grade points increased. I don't know if among the Hispanic students they have an acting white. Anybody know that?
See, is this among their own ethnic group or among this?
Among their own ethnic group.
Yeah.
Among their own, yeah. In other words, if you're a black student, your popularity goes down. If you're Hispanic, even worse. In other words, not by group, by individual. What happens to your popularity as your grades are increased? And here we see that the problem is basically eliminated in private schools. These figures come from a 2006 paper by Roland G. Fryer, a professor of economics at Harvard University. There he is on the bottom right. You have to turn off the lights so you can see him. He's got a little bit more melanin in his skin than I do. Okay. In the final paragraph of this paper from 2006, he says, oh, just didn't have that slide. Minority communities in the United States have yet to generate a large cadre of high achievers, a situation as discouraging as the high incarceration rates among minorities who never finish high school. In fact, the two patterns may be linked. As long as distressed communities provide minorities with their identities, the social costs of breaking free will remain high. To increase the likelihood that more can do so, society must find ways for these high achievers to thrive in settings where adverse social pressures are less intense. The integrated school by itself apparently cannot achieve that end. So here's generations of people living through the same, but worse than what I had in first grade. And then we wonder why we have problems with minority members not achieving. Yeah, they talk about that too. You're acting white. You're white on the inside and black on the out like an Oreo. Do we ever get this stuff about left-handed, right-handed? No. It's this legacy of slavery, and the color-coded, the slavery was a color-coded system.
Did they control for income in this?
Yeah.
I know the distribution is different with private public schools, and usually private schools are more wealthy, so.
Yeah, there's lots more interesting questions that could be asked. If you read, the paper is online, PDF, free. I can email you the URL if you're interested. And here's something else to ponder as we come kind of to the end of this, scratching the surface of this education topic. Many of us broke free from our religious communities that provided our identities. I still have a note from my grandfather saying, Tim, always remember you're a Catholic. That was my identity. Now, these were not economically distressed communities, perhaps, but there are adverse social pressures that I think many of us experienced when we left behind the religion we were raised in. How many experienced that? Nobody else? And most of us still experience such pressures when we resist being drawn into other communities that would welcome us. Yeah, they'd love to have us. Imagine growing up with these pressures and disincentives magnified many times, and imagine the stakes being your education and lifelong ability to succeed and find personal satisfaction. Of course, education is central to the life of every human being, but clearly it's also burdened with very significant challenges for many people. If you didn't experience those, then you're lucky, but many people do, and we all have a responsibility to try to figure out how to overcome those things so we can draw more people, think about how successful we could be and how lesser our problems would be. We've been seeing trucks driving through crowds of people and so on and so forth, if we're able to solve these problems. So please think about that. And thanks again to Kit for preparing the material at the Texas State Board of Education. And we have a few minutes to discuss things. Anybody have any comments?
So how is popularity measured? Just by the number of friends that they were?
They explained in the paper what they do is there was apparently a section where they asked them, how many friends do you have? Who are your friends? They actually put down the names of their friends, and they were able to go back and look at the names, and many of the names would show up multiple times. So the names that showed up the most were the most social popular kids. And then whether or not, and then they had a system, if you were one of those kids, of course, you're great popularity. If you were friends with one of those kids, it raised your popularity rating. If your friends were names that nobody else even mentioned, then your popularity would be low. Obviously, you're the three outcasts in the school. So I thought it was quite interesting how they did that. They explained in their paper, not in the ultimate detail, but that's basically how they did it, looking at your friends and who they were.
Like Google page ranking.
Like a Google page ranking. Yeah. That's amazing now when you go to Google and you start typing in and the rest of what you're looking for pops up. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone in the world. Other people are trying to find this out too.
You mentioned incarceration rates. That actually might make for an interesting future topic. Did you know that the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated people?
Yeah. Of course, the other way to look at it is to say that in all those other countries, bad guys are running around free.
That's what they'd like you to think.
Or maybe. Of course, that also goes to, does a wealthier society spend more time and spend more of its funds locking people up? Certainly a wealthier society spends more money on medical care. And I remember, again, in my grade school memories, some of our social studies texts, did any of you live back in the Paleolithic times? So they had, put up a little graph and it shows, look how many telephones they have per person in the Soviet Union. Look how many we have in the U.S. And they had so many fewer, or miles of roadway. I remember seeing those things in the social studies text as a way to kind of put things into perspective. So maybe when you have more money, you're more willing to lock people up for not paying the parking tickets.
I actually looked on the web and did a little bit of research on this, and there are multiple factors
Yeah.
involved.
Right, and it'd be cool that we should definitely do a service in terms of criminal justice or criminal injustice really would be the topic more so. Yes?
I've met a lot of Turkish students that come here for work and travel visa, and they work and they the whole summer, and they have a few weeks to travel. One thing they keep asking me, why are these people not going to college? Americans, why Americans, that every American they see, not going to college, they don't care.
Oh, why don't Americans go to college?
Yes, well, they're here visiting and they're working, and they meet people and they're shocked that Americans are not going to college. They say, why? I said, I don't know. I really don't know why people don't care about college education. In Turkey, it's very important, and it's difficult to get in. It's free, but you have to pass a certain level.
You have to qualify.
Qualify, and they have private courses that go for months, and they just study to pass at those tests. I did. I had to pass tests to get into teacher training school, teacher training college.
So maybe it is a reflection of kind of a general anti-intellectualism, and of course that dovetails with
They still don't understand. I said, I really don't know. I didn't think about it that detail, but I know people kind of snob college education.
With the Texas State Board of Education. I mean, let's just keep the kids dumb because that'll keep them Christian and voting our way.
But they don't understand. Why are you keeping your kids dumb? This is your country.
One of the key things that stuck out to me that you said was the word free. And that is such a barrier in this country.
But I said,
because
well, that's true, but they said they wished it was for, they were able to pay and go instead of taking a test and go. It's easier to pay and go because you can study. I mean, you can work, save money, and pay and go. But over there, you have to pass an exam. It's very difficult. Even though it's free, but you have to pay. And they said, I don't have to take a test here, but I can pay. Yeah, I can work and pay and go.
Right. Well, of course, it seemed like a lot of traction that Bernie Sanders got was saying should be free college. Taylor?
Saying, like, gosh, you make working and paying your way through college sounds so simple. Like, a lot of people don't have jobs that are good enough to do that.
No, it's not simple.
Years and not be able to pay for college.
It's not simple. I did it. It's not simple. It was difficult. I had a family and I worked and I went to college at night. It wasn't easy. I didn't say it was easy, but it's possible. It's more possible than passing a test. That's almost impossible.
Of course, students from Turkey maybe know how to be more frugal than Americans.
I don't know. That too. That's very possible too.
David?
Do other states have similar approval methods like
What do you know about that? Do other states that like the Texas Board of Education, you mean? What do you know about that, kid?
I don't.
Texas is what gets all the news.
I mean, I have a little familiarity with my home state, but I don't know if they approved textbooks back in New York.
Wasn't Kansas in the news for having a kind of fundamentalist anti-evolution stuff too?
And I think will be interesting topic of textbook content is we've now got a whole new generation that is using videos and social media as part of learning. I need it with my own kiddos going into middle school. If there's a topic he doesn't get, he doesn't doesn't process right away, he'll go on the internet and look at information on Wikipedia and on YouTube and try to dive deeper. And those are going to have more and possibly different information than what's going to be in the standard textbooks, which then will bring up the question of will this generation identify that the textbooks may be faulty or slanted, as opposed to earlier generations where that was all we had.
It's a little
Well,
harder, yeah.
have you heard how?
Decades ago, they were saying it's the information age, but really until you have access to the information. You know, even this thing like the Acting White paper that I was talking about, it's on the internet as a PDF. How easily would been able to access that decades ago? Not.
Yeah, well, you've heard how conservatives were so disappointed with Wikipedia being liberal, right? As in not promoting conservative thought, that they tried to come up with their own conservapedia. I don't think it was successful at all because, you know, but yeah, they just like, oh no, we can't have this. You know?
Well, it's kind of, why would you want to go to some place that was pushing a particular, we're going to slant everything the way you believe, so come here. Yes?
What, I'm sorry. I have, my son's friend was Mormon, they're ex-Mormon family, and they, you know, they're not in Mormon religion anymore. But what I understand, though, their number one problem is internet. They don't know how to keep it together because internet is out there and everybody's getting into it, and now they don't know how to keep religion together.
Not too hard to find out that the Native Americans came over from a land bridge from Asia and have Asian genetics and everything.
Yeah.
Not that they're transplanted Israelites.
Yeah,
Did you have a comment too, Eric?
Yeah, I was curious, so even if the content in textbooks was all hunky-dory, it seems like the objective of educating our youth is not to really educate them, but to get them to pass exams. So, and I've heard this from teachers, that they have so much pressure on them to get their students to pass these exams, they can't really spend the time like really educating and exploring the topics.
Kid's nodding her head. She taught for a while.
Well, I think yeah, there's a big problem with that because from a government perspective, you know, when you have to have standards and know whether or not the standards are working, they have to have some kind of measurement. And right now, I think that's the only tool that they have that's objective. And they're looking for an objective measurement. What's an objective measurement of how well you're doing? A test. And there's very little room for subjective
And I think some
measurements.
impetus for that too comes from the colleges who wind up having to have remedial courses for the freshmen because they say they can't read, they can't do this, can't do that. And so then that turns the pressure back on the, you know, it's like having an assembly line. You get to this point and the workers say, hey, everything we're getting is defective. What are they doing over there? So, you know, they have to do the quality control back here. Yes?
Yeah, I also think it's important when we encounter people that may be misinformed because of a poor education, that we not be so quick to be so harsh toward them. I'm thinking primarily of evolution.
Yeah, there are people just have not been even exposed to the idea.
I mean, I think I was exposed growing up in a religious household, but I had everything else from the outside coming in, and just so much noise that it kind of covered that up, I think. And so even in the past couple of years, my own learning about evolution has just been like, I don't remember learning this when I was growing up. And it's
Well, the Center for Science, the National Center for Science Education, Eugenie Scott's outfit, has said over the years, and this is a group that promotes the teaching of evolution in the schools and trying to combat efforts to keep it out, that a large majority of high school science teachers do not understand evolution. And it is a little bit, they can change over time and all this sort of thing, but it is a little bit difficult to think about. I try to do this remedial education with my patients too, especially my overweight patients like me, and I say, well, you know, we're sort of the victim of the fact that we are here because our ancestors survived the famine. You know, in other words, differential reproductive success. It's not just about you change for the better. There actually were pressures, and we did not descend from the people who had the problems that didn't allow them to survive to reproduce. Yeah.
Big case in Kansas.
It wasn't that long ago. That's where the flying spaghetti monster came out of. Can we have one of our programs should be presented by Siri?
It's COPE versus Kansas Board of Education. COPE versus Kansas Board of Education.
Okay, yeah, of course, Kitzmiller is great reading too. And by the way, on this whole subject of education, one of the websites I found that was very helpful is the Harvard Graduate School of Education. They have some workshops and projects in there to try to find little things, that, doable things to introduce into public schools, because it's so difficult to get a total commitment on the part of all the teachers. I mean, all of us went through school, we know there were teachers there who were just punching their time clock, just trying to get to retirement, and other teachers that were enthusiastic, knew their material, that, it's really inspiring to learn from somebody who's excited and likes and enjoys what it is that they're teaching versus somebody who's just, open your books to page 60 and we're going to take turns reading through the class while they sit up there and do whatever they do these days. You never did. All right, well, a few more slides left, and you're going to think about this the rest of the week, and come to Jason's afterwards. But remember, Freethought is not free. We have these rainbow-colored boxes in the back room. That's what they're for. You put your cash and diamonds and all of that sort of thing in there that you don't need. That filthy lucre, it will just corrupt you. There are reasons to give us your money, primarily being that we're doing together what none of us can do on our own. I think it's easy with the internet, as we were saying, that everything is available to you and so forth. It tends to atomize our culture, but there still are many things that we can do better and more effectively together, right? Like we heard at one of the political conventions, stronger together. So help us promote your values, and as Gandhi said, demonstrate your commitment by being the future that you wish to see. So go in the joy of reason, and then the next service is September 4th, 4 weeks from now. We'll be a little shorter than this last 5 weeks, and we'll talk about the media. And the bulletin that says media matters, the media, I don't know if I can think of a better subject, or if you can think of a better, cutie title, let me know. It'll be again here at the Comfort Inn. And who does not know how to get to Jason's? And follow one of us. It's right off of MacArthur. You go out here to Esther's, cross over 114, and it's like the second light. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, those really informative. One of the mistakes I always think of is the rounding error that I think was in Desert Storm, one of the last missiles. I think in the computer system, because of the rounding error, they couldn't track one of those scouts coming in.
Oh, I hadn't heard of that.
Something to look into.
Well, of course, they didn't mention the Deepwater Horizon, but obviously a lot more people down in that Piper Alpha. Anybody have any memorable screw-ups of their own or others? This is one of the other things I just found too in people's writings. There's a book actually called Being Wrong, and the author talks about how when she was writing the book, she mentioned, people say, oh yeah, boy, you should have come to me because I've had the most colossal screw-ups. And she said, really, you don't tell me about them? Oh, I can't quite remember them. Not really very memorable.
What's the guy that said it could have been the part owner of Apple?
Yeah, was that?
And he was afraid of liability?
Yeah.
And he never heard of a limited liability corporation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a big business expert?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Donald Trump's
back in
been
the day.
named a few times. You kind of wonder why that was a problem, but apparently he just didn't feel comfortable with those two. Of course, now who knows what's going to happen with Apple. They say that Apple's sales of their phones have kind of leveled off and they don't have any big blockbuster coming. Is that true, David?
What have you been saying that?
You've been saying that before, okay. Anybody else have comment? The what?
Probably a repeat.
It is.
Probably a repeat, but everybody knows or should know about a 380 that was, that's built by a consortium of French, Spanish, and German companies in Europe. And it's the biggest aircraft in the world right now. It grosses out at 915,000 pounds. So it's a large machine. It's got 4 engines. They each generate 83,500 pounds. For your information, that's about 70% of what the 8 engines on a B-52 generate. So they're very powerful engines. Most pilots recognize that when you run an engine, a jet engine up, you've got to run it up over concrete or dirt, not macadam, because the low pressure of the exhaust will lift the macadam and throw it quite a distance. And it can throw dirt, but it can't throw concrete if it's properly made. Well, anyhow, they delivered this 380 to Dakar in the United Arab Emirates, and the pilots that flew it there took off and said, "It's your machine," because they were going to have 4 pilots on that machine test flying it. So they decided to do a run-up. And in an empty aircraft with full fuel, you do a run-up with 4 engines that powerful. The brakes are not adequate to hold it. You can only do one run-up, one engine run-up at a time. In the B-52, we could only do 2. But we were only generating 14,000 pounds. But we did a run-up 8 engines because the brakes weren't adequate to hold it. Well, these gentlemen ran up full power, and the brakes gave, and it went into a wind glass fence. You know, they're great big curved fences. Went into one of those and broke the machine up. A total loss. That's sort of a mistake.
Yeah, so a lot more ways to, I could have done this service. I think I did it the wrong way this time, but they do ignorance next time, so that's pretty close. There were a lot of additional interesting quotes I came across. Here's one by a British historian who talked about Napoleon, the mistakes that Napoleon made. He says, like most of those who study history, Napoleon learned from the mistakes of the past how to make new ones. So, thought that was pretty good. Anybody else? You know, we have some snacks to enjoy. Yeah, Eric.
So at the very beginning of this service, I was thinking, how important is the language that we use? Because I think with right and wrong, I still need to think about morality versus truth value of what we're talking about being correct or incorrect.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit maybe about the language and sentence?
Well, of course, Aristotle said that no one does wrong knowingly, and this is the interesting thing about people, criminals, and all those kind of wrongdoers is they always have an excuse. In fact, right?
I neglected to mention something. That's an Airbus 380. I know it may not be important, but a lot of people may not recognize where the 380 came from. So the Airbus is a consortium company. Thank you.
It's a big
Very big. But anyway, with respect to, I mean, this, and it's interesting why right and wrong are terms that refer both to things like, the math error and so forth, and to moral things. A little bit in the bulletin about that, where W.K. Clifford talked about the fact that people often believe in things wrongly that are self-serving. He gave the example in his day of some guy who sends his ship to sea when he should have known that it was unsafe, but he convinced himself that it was safe because his money in his pocket, not to have to spend money on repairs and things like that. And when somebody goes out and just attacks somebody and murders them, that seems like it's very different, but the murderer usually has an excuse, Had an overwhelming compulsion. There was a case here in Europe where one of these Middle Eastern refugees created a big sensation, of course, partly because of that, but raped some little kid in a public pool, and his excuse was he had a sexual emergency. So people can convince themselves into believing crazy stuff. Just like the Pyrrhonists noticed, the second half of that. So the two things are related. The senses deceive us, are not always reliable, and people take their passions and their desires and put those before the reasoning process. But when they get all done, it looks like they reasoned themselves to what they did. So that's a real difficulty as to how you do that. I think, in fact, the problem with criminality, the really bad criminals, there was a good book by a guy named Stanton Samanow from years ago called Inside the Criminal Mind, where he talks about the fact that there are just certain people out there, they are self-serving, they have a sense of entitlement, they're going to get their way, and they'll rationalize afterwards why they did what they did. So they're wrong for doing what they did, primarily because, of course, properly functioning brain would not do that, just like properly functioning brain would not, a differently functioning brain would not be deceived by some of these illusions and so forth. I was going to ask you, Bernal, I know you're going to be here also about mirages, since you spent a lot of time flying in the Arctic regions. Did you see any of these superior mirages and weird stuff like that? No? I'm sorry, David. No, it's on. Yep. Sean. It's what, Frank?
Your microphone is better.
It's more really for recording, it's more for the recording, right, than necessarily amplification in the voice.
Yeah,
There's a small enough room.
Yeah, that's right. But, I may not have adjusted the thing perfectly. Anybody else? We got just a couple minutes left. We should get together at Jason's, those of us who want to spend some more time talking. Yes? Aaron, I'm going to have to put you up here and do part of the service next time.
One of the things I run across in speaking to people my age is a lot of times they just don't care what's right or wrong or the truth value of something. One of my good friends is, I think he's leaning agnostic, but he goes to church and does all this because it's expedient. He doesn't want to disadvantage himself in life. So I guess my question or thought is, why should we care about what's right and wrong?
Yeah, this is a question for all of us, isn't it? I mean, one of the things we get accused of is that we're atheists and so we can have no morality because God lays down a law about morality. But, what they're really saying is, in their way of looking at it, God says what's right or wrong, and if you don't obey, you're going to burn in hell forever. I mean, it's a carrot and stick. It's a threat type of thing. Whereas we've talked about this at past services, that from our point of view, you should do right because it's right. Because to act against the principle that other people are moral agents with who are as entitled to as much as you are, it's like violating the principle that 2 and 2 is 4. You're just stepping outside of that. And what's going to stop you from doing that? Not a being up there, but rather to turn. We're accused of wanting to be our own gods, but in that sense, that's really how it works, isn't it? There's one person that knows everything you do, all the little corners that you try to cut, all the excuses you make for doing something you know you probably shouldn't, and that person is you. And you have to live with yourself, and it's your opinion of yourself that counts the most, and that you can't ever escape. So unfortunately, these ideas don't get communicated or talked much about. And I know what you're talking about. I mean, my own kids have at times said, "Oh, there's no such thing as right or wrong." Well, there's not in the sense that there is these chairs. Right or wrong is not a physical thing. But these are terms that we use to refer to behaviors and ways of thinking as to whether or not they're consistent with the real world and with the principles of logic that apply to the real world. What do you think? I mean, it's not really anything that you can give one answer to. Does that sound like a good approach? As good as any? John, yeah. John is our videographer. He's been back here taking in everything.
Yeah, I was wondering, how many of you people have heard of a website called PolitiFact?
What?
PolitiFact?
PolitiFact.
PolitiFact. What they do is they analyze statements made by public figures, politicians, whoever makes a statement that's newsworthy. They have people that go out and investigate the statements and rate them to whether or not they are true or false on a scale. With true being, of course, absolutely true as far as they can tell from their investigation. And pants on fire is their lowest rating, which is people saying things that are not true and they should know better. So that's one among many of my sites that I would consider skeptical sites in the sense that they go out and they evaluate the truthhood or falsehood. Not necessarily lies, people can just be misinformed when they say these things. But PolitiFact is one, Snopes, of course, is another, everybody's familiar with that one. There's also factcheck.org. So try out PolitiFact if you haven't. It's got some really entertaining stuff because somebody mentioned about the number of statements that Trump made that are false. And it turns out that if you split it down the middle, I think at last count, 77% of the statements that were rated either
Pants on fire?
Either half false, no, not pants on. He's got the most on in that category. As a matter of fact, they awarded him an award for having made the most public statements that were demonstrably false. But it's also entertaining to go find some of the some of the statements other people have said, they do a really good job of researching, giving the person or organization the opportunity to correct themselves. They try to contact them. They are very focused on us. You were mentioning language. They said language matters, all right, and the context matters, and so they do a really good job. So I really recommend it.
Yeah, of course, those who make the most statements will make the most errors too. I remember when I was in high school, there was one of these